These faces that gaze back at us were painted more than 1,800 years ago in the Fayoum region of Egypt between the 1st and 2nd centuries of our first millennium. In his quest for immortality, man wanted to record for eternity an image of himself, a graphic representation we call the portrait. Spanning the centuries, the portrait depicted by the skilled hands of great masters became the exquisite art of recording the face. In essence, it became the face of the art itself. From the exquisite to the sublime, it was just one step. In portraiture, this step was taken by Rembrandt. Rembrandt reached beyond the surface of the subject's face and captured his very soul. Leonardo da Vinci. Albrecht Dürer. Raphael. Hans Holbein. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Vincent van Gogh. Such names have exalted the art of portraiture. In the 19th century, photography joined with painting to immortalize faces. This self-portrait of Gaspard Félix Tournachon, called Nadar, reveals one of the greatest of this field of photographic art. Many noted personalities of the 19th century posed for his lens. His outstanding style and technique were equaled only by the elegant simplicity of his works. Closer to our era of the 20th century, portrait photography attained new levels of maturity through the work of Yusuf Karsh, photographer of princes, who himself became the Prince of Photographers. It is within this long tradition of the classical portrait that we can today position the excellent works of Louise and Joseph Simone. The art of portrait photography, which the Simones have continually refined over the years, calls for the very same fundamentals as those established over the centuries of classical painting. The modern view and personal interpretation by these two artists, and the intuitive creativity inspired by their subjects, are firmly based on the golden rules of composition and the immutable laws of light and shadows. Golden rules, yet forever new and evolving. Immutable laws, yet newly rediscovered in each photo where the emotion of the session is colored by the light at that moment. For portraits taken outdoors, the Simones guide themselves by the ambient light. Here, these photographers adapt to its intensity, direction, and ratios. They compose according to the light they see. In studio photography, it's totally the opposite. Light, or more precisely, the lights, will be turned on, directed, and proportioned. In a word, controlled, as these photographers see it. All lighting is based on the fill light, which is a uniform lighting that allows for detail within the shadows and determines the exposure of the negative. All other lights will be proportionate to this fill light. The backlight illuminates the background and lets the subject stand out. It is stronger than the fill light while remaining subtle and relative to background density. The hair light, which comes from behind and above the subject, adds highlights to the hairdo. Its intensity is relative to hair color and is stronger than the fill light. The accent light outlines contours. It is complementary to the main light and calls for a half stop more than the fill light. As for the key, or main light, it is directional and at 45 degrees to the facial plane in order to sculpt the face. It will be 1.5 stops more than the fill light. Starting from total darkness, the photographer gradually creates the right lighting by building his illumination. Generally, the Simones do not use a ratio greater than 1.5 stops. When the subjects are in profile, the key light comes from the rear at 45 degrees to the face to amplify the facial sculpting. As always, precautions must be taken to avoid any flaring of light into the lens, which would reduce the saturation of the image and the depth of the blacks. When the Simones work with children, the approach they try, even before entering the studio, will be the key to success. Because it is a new environment for the child, the Simones come down to her level by suggesting games that stimulate her interest. They achieve greater cooperation and compliance, which leads to the child's willingness for one or more sessions. In trying to maintain simplicity with few accessories to control, they capture the best facial expressions. In choosing clothing for the session, they took into account the preferences of the client by opting for a style reminiscent of the 1600s, the era of Rembrandt and Velázquez.
For younger children, we try hard to get them to forget the camera. In order to direct the gaze of this girl to the rose, we asked her to hide the candy under the flower resting on her leg.
It takes very little to create an effective set, and one which will do justice to the subject. Pieces of paper cut and glued onto the background, a gray column made up from an old backdrop and tied to a black screen by a paper diagonal. In the foreground, a desk with accessories. And there you have it. The set is ready for the businessman, an advertising man. Colored gels have been added to the background lights to evoke a certain atmosphere. This advertising executive has to express seriousness and determination while suggesting the originality of his profession. He will look directly into the lens with a posture exuding confidence and self-assurance. Since this businessman's office has ordered an enlargement for wall display, the Simones opted to work in a 4x5 format. Some black paper, an X-Acto knife, and imagination. That's all that's needed to create a charming set decor. Our next client, in her 20s, wanted to see herself in a more modern setting that reflected her personality and would blend in well with her home environment. For this portrait, and as they often do, Louise and Joseph Simone work as a team. The tiniest details are checked to ensure that her makeup, hairstyling, and clothing are impeccable. They look for just the right pose and set the proper tilt of the head to capture Karine in all her femininity. A black and white session with Kodak TMX film is first offered her over and above the color session, for which the Simones normally use Kodak PRN 100 film stock. For the 6x6 format portrait, the Simones favor the Zeiss 120mm lens with a subtle diffusing filter, and, as always, a lens shade is a must. For background lighting, they place red gels over the lights. A second background light is added because of the size of the set. A rim light with an intensity at least equal to the key or main light separates the subject from the dark background. The hair light is as strong as the main light. The accent light outlines the subject's contours, and the main light, set at 45 degrees from the face, adds sculpting. Finally, the fill light provides the required details to the shadows. A portraitist must know how to communicate with the subject and be a good listener, to observe and discuss with the subject at length before even entering the studio, so as to uncover character and so produce an accurate and totally personal portrait. In order to accurately portray certain subjects, it is sometimes good to photograph in the shadows and let the key light somewhat outline the face. In a profile shot, we allow some space in front of the face to create the illusion that the subject is looking off into the distance. The technique of feathering consists of turning the accent and key lights forward so as to trace an imaginary line originating from the center of each light. These lines would meet some 15 centimeters from the face to just brush it with light and bring out its texture. The closer the light is to the subject, the softer the shadows it casts. Hair color will also determine the intensity of this light. Using Kodak film and an Ektar 300mm lens on his 4x5 camera, Joseph Simone has succeeded in producing some of his best portraits.
Older people are a deep inspiration for me. By taking the time, you can analyze the whole being to bring out the beauty and serenity of age, and to obscure certain features by making use of the hands, which often reveal as much as the face.
The next session uses a high-key technique. It is a photo taken with strong lighting for a pastel effect. The ratio of light is slightly higher and the grading is soft and subtle. High key is ideal for young blonde-haired children, for young women of the same coloring, and for certain wedding photos. Pale toned clothing and a slightly pink-tinted background is suitable. High key lighting starts with two background lights. It differs from low key due to the light box or softbox. This is the main source of illumination for pastel lighting. It is a large, soft light source, one f-stop brighter than the fill light, so as to maintain a weak ratio. The two background lights are directed from each side. They have an intensity equal to the main light box, so as to maintain the purity of whites. The color gel on one of the background lights will be toned down by the combination of the two lamps. For pastels, we have to note the distance between the subject and the background and closely control its lighting. Too strong a light on the background can change the contours of the subject and the saturation of the image. It goes without saying that in the pastel photo, the softness effect is also accentuated by a diffusing filter. Pale colored clothing with no distracting motifs, as well as a general ambiance of simplicity, will allow us to concentrate all our attention on the subject. An image is pleasing to look at and truly artistic if it is well composed. According to the basic classical rules, the division of a rectangle into 1/3 area on each side gives us 4 strong points, one of which will be used as the principal point of interest. We recognize 5 principal types of composition. Composition from left to right, which is more comfortable since we read in this direction. Composition from right to left, when we want to stimulate a specific interest. L-shaped composition, which links 3 points of interest. S-shaped composition, which combines 2 points of interest, visible or not. And triangular composition. The triangle is considered as being the strongest form in composition. That's because the triangle is the base of a circle. Whether the triangle's shape is equilateral or isosceles. In the following examples, we are going to apply the rule of thirds to different compositions. Placing the grid of thirds on this photo, we note that the face is in the center of interest and across the diagonal, the golden section. The downcast eyes of the subject represents here the strong point. Vertical columns of varying height in front of and behind the subject are meant to create diagonals which vigorously directs the viewer's eyes toward the subject, while balancing the masses on either side. The position of the subject within the triangle directs our eyes to the main point of interest, which is the gaze of the little girl, toward a secondary point of interest, namely her foot. This direction is suggested by her pointing of the rose toward the tip of her foot through another diagonal. In this photo, which we can qualify as low-key, the lighting becomes integral with the composition. It serves to emphasize in a contrasting and rather dramatic manner this warm and intimate moment. In applying the grid of thirds, we note that the two profiles of the parents are located in the upper third, while the baby is in the lower third. Looking at it more closely, we note that the two shoulders of the parents form an inverted triangle that somewhat symbolizes a child's crib. Also, the two profiles of the parents inclined towards the baby become a kind of symbol of protection and form a triangle below it. These two opposing triangles serve to balance the masses. In tracing the diagonals, we see that the mother's eyes and the father's mouth follow these lines of force. All of this heightens the feeling of communication, which emanates from the eyes of the three individuals through a triangular shape. This triangle is echoed in the quasi-triangular position of the child. Taking the center of the two superimposed equilateral triangles, we recognize the center of a circle which contains these triangles. The whole suggests a composition from which a visual circular energy emanates. In this composition, our subject is located in the golden section, seeing that it is situated on the diagonal. The position of the individual is within a quadrilateral, where the triangle again solidly dominates. In this yellow monochrome, the subtlety of the lighting emphasizes the lines of the set. We feel the equilibrium of the masses in this geometric formation. The point of interest is supported in a kind of sentimental communion between the flower and the girl. Placing the grid of thirds on this photo of Cadine, we note that the eyes lie just above the upper line. The subject's position ties in with the lines of the columns to form a real diamond shape. The rest of the lines, similarly shaped, frame the subject in a way that balances the masses. The lines are arranged to produce a unity of tone and a relation between elements. The repetition of colors and shapes keeps the rhythm within a dynamic graphic and a three-dimensional composition. As we have just seen, the subject's pose is of major importance in the composition of a portrait. And next to the facial expression, it is the hands that speak with the most eloquence in what we call body language. It reveals a facet of the subject's personality. But in order to give greater importance to the face, which must be the main point of interest, the hands will become secondary support points. By displaying their profile, they attract less attention and become directing lines leading to the point of interest. Moreover, the profile position always lends more elegance to the hand. With these final adjustments to the pose, the portraitists confirm the diamond-shaped composition of this photo of Cadine. As in all the arts, photography is a chain which is only as strong as its weakest link. If everything is controlled during the photo session, we avoid many problems at the printing stage. Because to achieve a quality portrait, it is essential to have good communications with your laboratory and technician, and to maintain strict control right to the end. For prints and enlargements, the Simones favor Kodak Supra F. This glossy paper allows for all the impact and brilliance desired. Retouching is a step that can't be ignored in photo finishing. The portrait is a single fixed image which has to contain all the information required in order to do justice to the subject. That is why, in spite of all his artistic effort, the portraitist, concerned about realism and objectivity, must make sure not to alter his subject too much. For instance, making an older person too much younger looking takes away from the character, that which truly gives it strength, richness, and beauty. However, some retouching is worth doing, even on a 6x6 negative. Another important link in the creative chain is the texture of the finish you want for the enlargement. The Simones recommend laminating the image, which is then applied onto a canvas and hot stamped. The result is a most eloquent texture, reminiscent of the canvases of the great masters. Going right to the end means carefully selecting, together with the client, the framing that will give the portrait that final touch and which will also blend in well with the decor in which it will be displayed. Whether the portrait artist was Rembrandt or Raphael, Nadar, Karsh, or Simone, they each had to look deeply at the subject, to observe closely, to see the radiance, to be captivated and enriched by the image before them. In a span of over 20 years, the Simones have given their works the full measure of what they have seen, all that they have long been observing, and by all that has enriched the experience of their vision. For what is a portrait, if not a look, the gaze of a subject looking back at us, the actual reflection of the portraitist's own view of the subject?
For me, photography is a means of expression and of communication par excellence. It is a medium which has no other limits than the ones we impose on ourselves.
The most precious advice I have ever received and can pass to others is to look closely and to carefully observe. By the power of observation, we find the image through attention to the smallest of details. I have always considered light to be the most important tool, which can either embellish or diminish. Light evokes in us the feelings and the memories of the images.
Each time I enter the studio to create a portrait and I am building my lighting, I catch a glimpse of the mysterious and apprehensive look of a subject that develops a kind of collusion between us, a projection of warm and friendly feelings which become an instant source of inspiration that reveals the person to me in all his naturality.
The key elements for making good portraits are composition and light. Painters use a brush and we, photographers, use light. You can almost call it a form of writing.
Knowledge acquired must be shared. We have the responsibility to develop our potential to the fullest in order to grow and help others grow.
It is important to learn to write a legible image, one that needs no long explanation. There is no magic formula. 1, 2, 3 lights and more if needed. You stop only when you're satisfied. And there again, you can always improve. I love my art, and I feel esteemed by what I have accomplished. When I have been able to become closer to people, in sharing our experience with others, we keep moving along the road of professional and human development.
Over the millennia, we have always considered the portrait as the exact representation of an individual. This holds true whether the portrait was done with a brush, a pencil, or with camera, film, and lighting. And when an image is produced with the spirit of soul, it becomes not only the portrait of the subject, but of the artist as well.